Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. Thank you all for coming out on what is an absolutely filthy day. And thank you so much for the invitation to be able to speak with you all today. I don't have any slides. There are no pictures in my book, so it's going to be word pictures or nothing. Jenny suggested to me that one of the best ways to try and do one of these things, rather than try and summarise a 300-page book in 45 minutes, would be to tell you a couple of stories in detail from the book. So I chose the weirdest stories from my book. There will be 2 of them, and I'll work through them in turn. So, one morning in late December 1750, 2 Jamaican doctors in Kingston fought a duel to the death. After an ever more contentious debate in print over the preceding several months, the 2 confronted one another in person. Intemperate language led to blows, then to the offer and the acceptance of a challenge. Very early on the 29th, Parker Bennett arrived at John Williams' house, armed with sword and pistols, and called his adversary out. Williams, according to a later report, loaded his pistols, affixed his sword to his wrist, opened his door enough to present his pistol, and shot Bennett in the chest. Bennett, by this version of events at least, was considerably more chivalrous. He had delivered his own arms to his servant when he turned up to the door, reeled backwards under the force of the shot to try and go get them. Pursuing him, Williams fired a second time, catching Bennett in the knee. By this point, Bennett had reached his sword, which he now found to be stuck so firmly in its scabbard that he could not draw it. Williams, drawing his own weapon, struck Bennett under the right arm and ran him through before turning to make his exit from the scene. Bennett, somehow still alive, caught his opponent before he could make his escape. Having finally worked his own sword free, his thrust pierced Williams beneath his right clavicle and severed the jugular vein, breaking off in the body. Word pictures. Williams died almost instantly, while Bennett survived him by roughly 4 hours, one assumes just long enough to offer a story that reflects considerably better on his honour than his dead adversaries. Now, although the 2 had known one another for several years and had possibly harboured grudges for some time, the immediate cause of their dispute was a book that Williams had published earlier in 1750, an essay on the bilious or yellow fever of Jamaica. Now, on reading, the essay seems insufficient to have produced such an effect, for it's a reasonably innocuous medical work, no more critical of other authors and physicians than most others of its time. What seems to have incensed Bennett, however, was a relatively brief passage in Williams' preface, which drew a distinction between practitioners who had been in the West Indies for some time and who hence possessed adequate local knowledge and experience, and those who had arrived more recently, having possibly been trained in an elite medical institution in one of Europe's metropolitan centres. It appears to me, wrote Williams, that no man, let his genius or stack of learning be what it will, can be a judge of the disorders of this country without faithful observation and experience. Yet the passion for novelty is so great amongst us that some persons sacrifice life itself to it. Williams appended a Latin tag from Virgil's Aeneid, "Oh, what great insanity is this, citizens," before continuing. A newcomer, whose head is filled with theory and darling hypotheses, by some will be trusted before a man who hath made himself acquainted with the diseases of the country and prudently follows the vestigial of nature, never sacrificing his patient to any favourite hypothesis. You can guess this, but Bennett was precisely such a newcomer, having obtained his medical degree in Edinburgh in 1745, and his gloss on Williams' remarks, published in the title An Inquiry into the Late Essay on the Bilious Fever, provides an idea of how quickly the discussion would devolve. So this is the quote. The second paragraph in the 4th page is a very extraordinary one and requires a small paraphrase. "O ye men of Jamaica, are ye not a parcel of blockheads? To trust your lives in the hands of a newcomer, of a man who's been at the university, who has attended the nasty lectures of Morgagni, Albinus or Monroe, whose head is filled with the whimsical notions of Boerhaave, and who knows no more of diseases than what he has learned by seeing the trifling practice of European hospitals. Come to me, I am your faithful Hippocrates of Jamaica. Now, if he was young and new to Jamaica, Bennett nonetheless also claimed relevant experience. Quote, some of us have been in Africa on board Guineamen and in other islands of the West Indies as well as he, consequently are equally entitled to write upon and cure the yellow fever. Yet Bennett would draw on relatively little of that experience in making a mockery of William's probity, his competence, his Latin, his erudition, and with repeated references to his opponent as Mr. John Williams, his lack of a degree. Williams replied in print with a poem describing, quote, Bennett, whose trifling writings no point hit, that fop in learning and that fool in wit. Bennett, in turn, I think reasonably, responded with an attack on Williams' quote, bad poetry, false measure, and vile logic, referring to the poem as the quote, idle nonsense of a conceited dunce, and its author as a quote, forward cringing fop. Why Williams thought it would be helpful to reply at this point is not clear. Don't do this if you ever get involved in this academic kind of debate, graduate students. Perhaps he saw that the alternative to words, correctly, was a violence the end of which could not be predicted. But in any case, reply he did, defending himself against charges that he had prescribed a deadly quantity of opium to some of his unfortunate patients by appending supportive letters from the apothecaries who had filled his prescriptions. But he also responded to the central point of Bennett's original indignation. Quote, but you were pleased to take offence at the preface, I hear, where I say a newcomer must be liable to more errors in his practice than a person who hath had a great share of observation and experience, or words to that purpose. Pray, sir, is not this the truth? Would Dr. Mead deny this? And would not that great man be at a loss himself on his first arrival in a southern climate? The final document in Williams' letter to Dr. Bennett was dated November 27th, 1750. Both men would be dead a little over a month later. So the story of Bennett and Williams is a bizarre one. I did a little dance when I found it. But it's also revealing, opening a door towards a more general set of questions that the book seeks to examine. What determined the social status of medical practitioners in the metropole and far-flung colonies? Which of several competing epistemologies and ontologies were correct? Was there something that bound the diseases of the tropics together and marked them as distinct to those of more temperate regions of the earth? And how might one become habituated to a climate and a range of distempers radically different from that in which one was born? So I'm going to elaborate on those questions, and then I'm going to turn, that's the second story, to a short work discussion of gender, sexuality, medicine, and race in the torrid zone. So at the heart of Bennett and Williams' deadly disagreement, we can see were concerns over who had the appropriate training, social standing, and experience to speak to medical matters in the colonies. That socio-political question could not be resolved, of course, without simultaneously considering a second set of questions. To what extent were the diseases of the Indies really different to those of Northern Europe? If they were essentially the same, surely one might prefer the ministrations of a physician who had received a degree from one of the leading universities in Europe and who could claim, as Bennett did, practice in European hospitals. But if the disease environments were radically different, on the other hand, one might well call in a doctor whose knowledge went beyond the ailments afflicting the inhabitants of London or Edinburgh. Now, the question sounds strange to our modern ears, for we're familiar with tropical medicine as a particular specialty. As a child in Australia, hence the accent, born to Indian parents, I remember well the trepidation that accompanied excitement at the thought of visits to relatives in Delhi. Foul-tasting quinine tablets and painful shots always diluted my enthusiasm for the journey, as did almost ritualised discussions between adults about the relative likelihood of us contracting cholera, typhoid or malaria. But some of you will recognise this conversation. But tropical medicine was born at the end of the 19th century, and in 1750, Bennett and Williams were on the cusp of a new understanding of illness between the tropics. When, then, and why did Anglophone physicians begin to see the diseases of warm climates as different in kind, not merely degree, from those of cooler locations to the north? Relatedly, when and why did medically significant differences within Northern Europe, which had been an object of considerable interest for some time, begin to pale in significance relative to a larger difference between Europe and the tropics? A sizable part of the answers to these questions came in analyses of the disease that was the subject of Williams' first essay, yellow fever. It was an irony, much like many other ironies, it was an irony utterly lost on the two rancorous combatants that the fever in question gained much of its intellectual interest from the fact that it, like Williams, seemed to distinguish sharply between those who were habituated to the climate of the West Indies and those who were new to it. The fever was particularly fatal, Williams noted, quote, to strangers, Europeans and North Americans. If one survived the first attack, however, one was unlikely to be afflicted again. At the very least, a second bout of the fever would be considerably less violent. So today, when we point to the transmission of the yellow fever virus through the bite of mosquitoes, we invoke the body's production of antibodies to explain our acquired immunity. For 18th century physicians, almost no part of this reasoning would have made sense. It is striking to me how often they talk about mosquitoes without ever, of course, realising that the places where you get mosquitoes are dangerous for the reasons that we would argue today. Now, according to Williams, this is the alternate explanation, newcomers from the north were particularly vulnerable to the disease because they possessed tense fibres and were plethoric. They had a plethora of blood, which liquid was also heated then upon arrival in the Indies. Think about a kettle here as it warms up. The warmth caused the blood to expand and become rarefied, pressing upon the rigid vessels that contained it. That rarefied blood travels more quickly through the body, increasing, it turns out, all secretions they claimed except those by urine and stool. And yet these last two were the body's means of removing excess bile. A redundance of bile, Williams declared, together with that stiffness of the fibres and richness of the blood, are obvious and sufficient causes of their proneness to this fever. For Williams then, the best treatment was to bleed strangers on their arrival, reducing their excess blood, a process to be continued until their bodily fibres relaxed and their juices assimilated to the air of the country. At that point in common parlance, they could be said to be seasoned to the climate. So associated then with questions concerning socio-political status, conceptual foundations and geographical taxonomies, another strand that runs through the book is the history of this idea of seasoning. It's actually how I came to this topic in the first place. So the term dates back to at least the 15th century when one finds the verb to season used in a sense very similar to the most common modern understanding, to render a dish more palatable by the addition of some more savoury ingredient. The word derives from the Old French saisonner, meaning to ripen, to render fruit palatable by the influences of the seasons. A second, somewhat different and later English term flows from this original French usage, for one also, of course, speaks of seasoned timber or seasoned metal. You've probably seasoned a cast iron pan. I had to season cricket bats when I was back home. In this case, a particular treatment, usually related to the way in which the material will later be used, brings it to a kind of maturity or ripeness. The analogous use of the term for people, to be inured to rough conditions by training and experience appears already in the early 17th century. It seems commonplace, we should note it's still in use, it seems commonplace to speak of seasoned soldiers in particular by the 1680s. The idea of a seasoning sickness, however, meaning an illness that habituates the body to a particular environment or climate, and which crucially is experienced only once, seems to be a product of the late 17th century. And certainly 18th century travellers, doctors, soldiers and sailors all paid a great deal of attention to an illness that seemed to be a disease of place. Seasoning affected neither natives nor those who had spent a good deal of time in a specific locale. Only those habituated to one location who ventured to another in which they were strangers fell ill. If they survived their affliction, their bodies were then inured to the novelties of the environments in which they then found themselves. And increasingly, through the 18th century, yellow fever was seen by many as the seasoning sickness par excellence. I should note it becomes a crucial issue in the slave trade. A standard calculation, both by abolitionists and others, notes that in the 18th century, 30% of new slaves die in what is called the seasoning. That was used by abolitionists for obvious reasons, to talk about the horrors of the slave trade, but it was also factored in as an economic calculation. Seasoned slaves were worth about 30% more than unseasoned slaves, factoring that matter in. So Bennett and Williams' dispute then turned on a number of the differences alluded to in my title. Both men, however, were silent, perhaps because it was beyond dispute, on what may have been the most important distinction for social life in the West Indies, that between populations enslaved and free. For much of the 18th century, that social and legal distinction mattered more for physicians interested in the diseases of the islands than did questions of what we will later think of as biological race. Doctors treated black slaves and noted that they often suffered disproportionately from the same diseases that afflicted whites, and sometimes from diseases that seemed distinctive to them. Yet most put those differences down to factors derived from their patients' position as slaves. Poor diet, inadequate clothing and housing, or else to different beliefs about the causes and cures of their afflictions. White and black bodies, neither of which crucially were deemed native to the Indies, both of which required seasoning, responded in similar ways to the climate. But matters would begin to change beginning in the 1760s. So in later chapters, the book explores the relationship between the theories of what has become known as race science and has been examined particularly for the 18th century, almost exclusively within the European metropole, and the theories of medicine and science within a colonial, racially mixed population. The history of medicine, I hope to show across the book, provides an ideal way of exploring the history of an empire defined as much by its structuring differences as by its putative unity, while the history of empire allows us to tease out the locatedness of medical discourse about specific locations. So, that's the first story and its outcome. Now the second. This one, well, I'll explain it. In 1777, the naval surgeon Robert Robertson published the physical journal that he'd kept during 3 voyages to Africa and the West Indies a few years before. As part of his discussion of illnesses on the island of Antigua, Robertson related the story of Charles Duplessis, a butcher who presented himself to the surgeon in pain and with a penis and scrotum considerably enlarged. Duplessis would die a few days later, and after his death, Robertson was informed, although he had no great faith in the information, that the butcher had been drunk the day before he had taken ill and had lain, quote, with a black woman that night who had blown him. Wait up. Robertson professed to being ignorant, quote, of what was meant by his having been blown by the woman, hold on, but called in another man from the ship who apparently, quote, had formerly sustained a like injury from a whore. The informant claimed to have noticed nothing unusual in the act of coition, but felt certain that the woman was at fault since she ran away as soon as she left the bed and never approached him again. As motive, he noted with disturbing insouciance that both he and Duplessis, with whom he had conversed, had beaten the women before having sex with them, and that the butcher's partner had also fled afterwards. Now, all but ignoring the violence committed against the women, Robertson treated the case as one almost supernatural, crediting the prostitutes, if such they were, with powers positively diabolic and used against men who he claimed had done little to earn their ire. It would appear, he noted with some relief, that only some prostitutes have this infernal act of blowing a man in the act of coition. He confessed himself still perfectly ignorant of it, but if it really is in the power of a prostitute to commit so hellish a trick, I think it very providential that so few of them know the art, otherwise I may venture to say that they would treat men in that abominable manner for every slight offence. Now, when I first encountered this story, I was almost as puzzled as Robertson about what blowing could signify, for the meaning that 21st century readers would most likely attach to the word, particularly in a sexual context, is of fairly recent provenance. The OED lists the first usage of that kind in 1933. Of course, I stumbled across the correct explanation only after I had published the book. I still included the story. Volume 1 of Thomas Winterbottom's Account of the Native Africans in the Neighbourhood of Sierra Leone, 1803, contains a chapter on the union of medicine with magic, in which the physician to the colony discusses, quote, a strange practice, but note this, of which the Europeans accuse the Africans. Now, quote, they are said to cause the body of any person to swell to a prodigious size by merely blowing upon them. This is sometimes done by contact and in so secret a manner as not to be observed by the injured party. At other times it is done by blowing a certain substance through a long tube at people as they cross a distant path. Now, Winterbottom was uninclined to treat the phenomenon as a real one. Having made many inquiries on the subject, he wrote, I'm convinced that the story of blowing is founded only on idle report and deserves to be classed only amongst fables, those remnants of superstition and ignorance so abundant in every country, and which, by being frequently repeated among the lower classes of Europeans, has gained established credit. So in Winterbottom's telling, blowing is a European fiction ascribed to Africans and, from Robertson's testimony, those in the West Indies of African descent. But there seems to be no proof among those of African descent that this is a thing that anybody does. So here, for the second part of the talk, I aim to offer a survey of some of the most standard tropes regarding relationships between gender, sexuality, race, and disease in 18th century medical texts. Robertson's story is certainly weird, but it's only so because of its seemingly supernatural flavour. Otherwise, it trafficked in an element of discourse common in 18th century medical texts about the dangers that women of African descent presented to the health of European men. Diabolic artifice, in this case, takes the place of a more common depiction of black women as the sources for diseases that could injure or kill. Sir Willem Bosman, for example, served for more than a dozen years as chief factor for the Dutch on the Guinea coast and devoted a sizable portion, he himself correctly called it a tedious while, of one of his letters home to the marital practices of the inhabitants. Bosman evinced some sympathy for the, quote, whores that made up the subject of part of his narrative, noting that their deaths were wretched and miserable, being soon infected and dying young. The naval surgeon John Atkins had no such sympathy in 1737, laying the original cause of venereal disease at the feet of common women and women alone. Quote, When the venereal appetite is jaded with the too intemperate efforts of several men, it will be next to impossible for those parts to suffer the continued frictions made there, as common women do, without excoriating and fretting the membranes of the vagina, and such excoriations, how small soever in the beginning, meeting with an ill habit of body, will soon degenerate to an ulcer, which ulcer will be the distemper. So this was a not uncommon etiological explanation, and you'll note it's one that served to largely absolve men of guilt in the spread of diseases connected to the sexual act. However promiscuous men might be, the fault lay with prostitutes that served as the reservoir of illness. Racialized elements then entered this common discourse via claims that African women and their descendants were essentially all prostitutes. So that's then the link. The surgeon Robert Thomas, for example, warned European ladies against using a, quote, Negro or mulatto woman as a wet nurse for quote, it is a great chance if she does not harbour in her blood the relics of many dreadful disorders, such as the yaws, leprosy, or a venereal taint, as all this race of people give themselves up to an unlimited prostitution. All this race. Edward Long, polygenist author of The History of Jamaica, most odious racist of the 18th century, pointed to the excessive consumption of meat as one reason that Englishmen were more liable to bad fevers in the West Indies than the natives of other European countries, but he also emphasised their, quote, excessive indulgence in a promiscuous commerce on their first arrival with the black and mulatto women. Again, as every author will, ignoring the violence and compulsion involved in so many instances of sexual contact between whites and blacks in a slave society. Long argued that black women, whether free or enslaved, are, quote, few of them exempt from this virus. But they kept their affliction secret, quote, by every artifice in their power, that no delay may happen in their business, for a hindrance in this respect would be a certain loss of profit to them. In this way, black women with venereal diseases became part of a trope that Henri Eltink has described as that of the scheming black Jezebel, a bondswoman generally understood to be a prostitute who initiated a relationship with a white man, quote, solely to obtain material favours, and who then, quote, did everything possible to hurt her white partner immediately after he gave her money or gifts. European women tend to enter these medical writings, at least insofar as their gender was a salient element, in the context of pregnancy and childbirth. If the Bible appeared to license a unitary view of human races, it offered, of course, a binary conception of human sexes, with Eve produced in a special and derivative creation. Depending on what elements medical men discussed, this binary was more or less stark. Although scholars like Thomas Lacour have identified cases where even this boundary was blurred, the sources I've examined associated specifically reproductive elements solely with women. The key questions for many physicians and surgeons writing about parturition, menstruation, and menopause were about the ways in which such processes varied with the climate. On other medical issues concerning distempers that afflicted both sexes, differences were perceived as a matter of degree and not kind. As we shall see, effeminate men, like women, were deemed less liable to a fatal bout of yellow fever in climates that favoured the relatively emasculated. Now, many of the observations found in medical texts concerning the diseases of warm climates are perhaps best understood as cultural tropes rather than material aimed specifically at diagnosis or treatment, with numerous authors, for example, discussing the relative ease of childbirth in foreign climes. Now, this is a claim of considerable antiquity. Parts of Hippocrates' Airs, Waters and Places is dedicated to the difficulties attending childbirth according to location, diet and environment. At the beginning of the 16th century, I'm drawing on Jennifer Morgan here, Amerigo Vespucci made sure that a claim about the old world was also part of the understanding of the new. The women he observed in his voyage were, quote, very fruitful and refuse no labour all the while there with child. They travail in manner without pain, so that the next day they are cheerful and able to walk. As part of his travels, published in 1687, Jean de Thévenot claimed of Indian women that they are, quote, easily delivered of their children, and in common with women all over the Indies could walk about the day after giving birth. By the early 18th century, the topic is standard enough that Friedrich Hoffmann, in his Neo-Hippocratic Survey of Endemial Diseases, considered it a common axis upon which to compare the various peoples of the world. So, quote, in Ethiopia, the women are blessed with peculiarly easy and happy labours and are generally delivered on their knees. Borlaeus mentions the like hardiness and strength in the Brazilian women, who, as he informs us, do not keep themselves up for 5 or 6 weeks after labour like the European women, but set about their ordinary business next day after their delivery, though their bodies, however firm and healthy, are yet very small. I've often heard and read that in Batavia, the women immediately after their delivery go into running water and wash both themselves and their children without any danger to either. Now, less painful childbirth might seem to have been a positive characteristic, but it is not, of course, necessarily taken to be so. Since the agony of childbirth was part of the punishment inflicted upon Eve, the suggestion that some women were spared could carry with it a whiff of polygenism, the idea that not all people were created in the same act by God, and hence that there are multiple different species. Edward Long was characteristically offensive and distasteful in discussing African women who, quote, are delivered with little or no labour. They have therefore no more occasion for midwives than the female orangutan or any other wild animal. A woman brings forth her child in a quarter of an hour, goes the same day to the sea and washes herself. Consistent with Long's belief that the transportation of Africans to the West Indies improved them, so the slave trade, he also argued that, quote, childbirth is not as easy here as in Africa. Increased pain in childbirth, in other words, could be read as civilizational improvement. Now, of course, in less abstract terms, asserting that Afro-Caribbean women could labour even in the last months of pregnancy and return to work within days afterwards served to license a gruelling slave regime. Benjamin Moseley declared that, quote, hot climates in general are indeed very favourable to gestation and parturition, that difficult labours were uncommon, and that the lying-in period was short. Indians and Negroes, he claimed, sometimes make it an affair of a few days and sometimes of a few hours only, and then pursue their occupation. That said, abolitionists would focus upon the appalling treatment of pregnant and nursing women in documents that successfully turned public opinion against slave owners. One wonders whether this might have been the impetus behind the Jamaican doctor John Quire's correction of Donald Monroe's comments on this point. Monroe had read a letter from Quire on inoculation to the Royal College of Physicians in London in 1771 and had inserted a note concerning the propriety of inoculating pregnant women. Since the women involved were African, Monroe insisted, one need not worry too much. Negro women and others of hardy constitutions, he opined, who are much exposed to the open air, often bear children and go about their daily labour in a day or two afterwards and undergo many other things without the least inconvenience, which would be in danger of destroying those of delicate habits who have been educated in European luxury. Perhaps aware, one can only dream, that such comments could be regarded as callousness, Quire rejected them in a second letter. Whatever hardiness Negroes may possess, he noted, I do not find that the females enjoy that immunity from the evils of childbearing, at least in this country, that you seem to imagine. As a result, Quire claimed, such women were, quote, carefully nursed for a fortnight and excused from all kinds of labour, sometimes not emerging from her house for a month. Whatever the truth of this claim, and there are many correctly who suggested that slave women received no such careful nursing, its timing is worth noting. In 1773, a year after the Somerset case appeared to outlaw slavery on English soil, the plight of slaves was a matter of newly urgent public discussion. Quire may well have seen the value in not adding fuel to the fire, with talk of the physiological differences that putatively justified the comparative neglect of enslaved mothers. Now, as common as the trope that related warm climates and easy parturition was one that pointed within the same regions to sexual precocity and a concomitantly early decline. Girls soon arrive at maturity, wrote George Cleghorn in 1751, and soon grow old. The menses usually appeared before 14, frequently as early as 11, and could sometimes return twice a month. Why they were called the menses is not explained if they return twice a month. Nobody else reports a fortnightly period, but it was not uncommon to report that those living in warm climates might enter puberty at 10 or 11, when, as Thomas observed, it seldom appeared before 15 in colder regions. Long imagined a speeding up of existence in general for Creole white women in Jamaica who, quote, attain earlier to maturity and sooner decline than their northern counterparts, and who were not unseldom mothers at 12. They console themselves, however, that they can enjoy more of real existence here in 1 hour than the fair inhabitants of the frozen, foggy regions do in 2. Such a positive spin on precocity and early senescence was not granted to mulatto women, who arrived at puberty quickly but then declined dramatically after the age of 25, this is long of course, till at length they grow horribly ugly. By 1787, Moseley seemed to be aware of how familiar observations of this kind were, for he both confirmed the fact of early menstruation while rejecting the applicability of the wilder tales that filled travel narratives. Though females do arrive at early maturity in hot climates, there are none of those wonderful instances of early pregnancy in the West Indies that travellers speak of, and such as are said to have happened in other parts of the world. Now, perhaps more interesting than the repetition of this familiar refrain concerning menstruation were observations of the benefits it conferred on women with regard to susceptibility to diseases otherwise unconnected to reproduction. A sizable portion of the authors who wrote about certain kinds of fevers, usually including the yellow fever, noted a peculiarity about those most badly afflicted by it. The disease laid low the strongest and the most robust of men. In his description of the American yellow fever, John Lining observed that while the disease was almost fatal to valetudinarians and often deadly to the intemperate and those not habituated to the climate, it also seemed to particularly afflict those of an athletic and full habit. Louis Rupp, in a tract in the diseases of sailors, similarly pointed to young, robust men as those most likely to die the soonest from bilious fevers, as did John Hume, who noted that strong, muscular men were most liable to the true bilious or yellow fever, while those of a lax habit are least liable to it and most likely to recover. Now, a lax habit could be acquired in many ways. We probably know that, from dissolution to simple aging, but it was also an effect of heat or humidity. Moisture and warmth, this was their analogy, could cause the strings of a well-tuned instrument to sag. So too could the tense and rigid fibres of a strong male body. The body best suited to the tropics then was the diametric opposite of that, which was the perfect symbol of British manliness at home. As a reviewer of Charles Bissett's essay on the medical constitution of Great Britain phrased it in 1762, in rejecting the author's unusual assertion that Northern Europeans were less likely to suffer from inflammatory diseases, they write this: "We imagine that the world was persuaded that the very reverse of this assertion was true, that Northern constitutions are the most subject to fevers when transplanted into hot climates. Why? Because all bodies are the best adapted by nature for that climate in which they are produced and have been resident. That the inhabitants of warm climates are remarkable for a lax fibre, hence their weakness, sloth and effeminacy, and the women, and such as lead the most sedentary and inactive lives, are the most exempt from all feverish and inflammatory complaints. A new climate would exact a price for the discrepancy between the bodily constitution native to it and that of a stranger. a price particularly high for robust masculinity in a land suited to the effeminate and inactive. Gendered weakness then provided a kind of strength, or at least protection. The young and robust with the tensest fibres were the most obnoxious to the yellow fever, wrote John Williams, while women and men of lax habits are seldom seized with it, or when they are, come through with much less danger and difficulty. And although some authors were more inclined to point to social and behavioural differences to explain relative susceptibility to the disease, most thus appeared to point to gendered anatomies. Those who advocated bleeding as a treatment for the illness often also added a physiological reason to their anatomical explanations. The problem, as John Williams noted, was that Northern European bodies contained too much blood, we're back to the beginning, for their new climates, which then exerted an excessive pressure on the body's vessels as the fluid warmed. This plethora had to be removed, a problem that nature took care of for women on a monthly basis. In noting that European women in the East Indies seemed less subject to hepatitis, Stephen Matthews could not quite determine whether the cause was the delicacy of their formation or the menses, but he did observe that the greater the menstrual flow, the more relief the patient experienced. John Tennant was more sure of himself. Women are seldom invaded with the yellow fever, he asserted, which is owing to two reasons. One, they have a naturally lax fibre. Two, they have the benefit of menstrual discharges. Effeminate men, like the women they resembled in their fibrous anatomical structure, might be spared the most intense ravages of the illness, but they did not gain the benefit of women's physiological distinction. So relationships then between sex, gender, and climate and race were complex. One might observe claims of the radical differences between the sexes, the pain of childbirth introduced as a punishment for Eve at the fall, yet that proved to be modifiable according to whether one was in temperate or tropical climates. There were also more relative differences, where climate exacted a price from those whose English masculinity differed too much from the requisite effeminacy of their surrounds, and where specifically female processes such as menstruation could provide a kind of doubled protection. And there were cases where climate seemed to matter little, against tropes that portrayed black women as collectively emblematizing the worst of all feminine subversions, with elements that allowed their transposition from realms of natural affliction, perhaps worthy of sympathy, perhaps worthy of condemnation, to realms of supernatural and vindictive maleficence. All right, I'll stop there. Thank you.
So we have a few minutes for questions. And we're going to use a microphone for the tape.
You look at yellow fever in the West Indies. Did you ever do a comparison with some of the big yellow fever outbreaks in the United States, specifically like Philadelphia, where they had smaller slave populations and such?
So one of the arguments there's an ongoing argument about whether yellow fever is contagious or not. So there's an argument about whether it's coming from Sandeman, right? So it's already connected back. One of the super interesting things about this material is that whereas for most of the 18th century within the British Empire, apart from North America, you do not see an emphasis on racial differences in susceptibilities to disease. In the United States, you do. So Benjamin Rush, who's in Philadelphia in 1793, in fact asks members of the free black community to serve as nurses for whites during the yellow fever epidemic in 1793, on the grounds, he says, that they will not be afflicted by the yellow fever. 3 years later, after so many of those people have died, he then takes that back and says, I guess I was wrong about this having a racial component. So that's one of the differences, and the next book will contain much more about North America, but that's one of the striking differences. And part of the problem with the literature is that people don't actually seem to make the distinction that they should between what's going on in the West Indies regarding race and what's going on in the United States regarding race, this Atlantic world stuff is great, but there's also differences that we need to pay attention to.
Suman, just a comment. I worked 2 years in England.
Yeah.
And what you are talking about still applies in medicine. So the ones with the strongest and best fibers are from England. After that, in hierarchy, come the Scottish man, and then comes the Irish man, and at the very end come the Indian and the Iranian and all that.
Yeah.
It's really, in the hierarchy of medicine, it's still there.
Huh. I mean, it's remarkable and deeply depressing when I give these talks about the 18th century, where I have medical practitioners, Jafari is a doctor, who tell me that this stuff is still being taught. So I gave a talk on the 18th century. One of the places where you see race beginning to manifest within the British Empire at the end of the 18th century is discussions about whether black bodies feel less pain than white bodies. And you get a growing discourse that will then get cemented in the 19th century that suggests that indeed black bodies aren't as sensitive to pain. And so I gave this talk, and I had nurses come up to me afterwards and just show me a photograph from their nursing textbook, which indeed informed them that African American patients do not feel pain in the same way that white patients do, and that you should take that into account when delivering pain medication. It's an ongoing, they have endless studies of how pain medication is not given to black women, for example, during childbirth in the same rates that it's given to white women. But it was remarkable to me that they taught it as a physiological fact rather than just a kind of a folk practice that continues. That they were willing to put it in writing was wow. Now. Oh, you need to use the mic, I'm afraid.
Oh, I said fascinating.
I wanted to get that on tape.
Double F. And so many places, there's so many questions to ask. And I guess I wanted to come back to the topic at the end about it sounds like a class stratification in the ideology of fiber, doesn't it? Fiber, and I wonder if you have thoughts about the ideological function there. I mean, it would seem counterintuitive that the robust European laborers, the people that one might depend upon for a workforce and so forth, are supposedly the most vulnerable. I mean, this seems very counterintuitive to an ideology of I guess, colonialism. So, do you have any thoughts about that?
They don't. I feel like the depiction of working classes as robust is not where they're going here.
I see.
So the working class are dissolute and not to be trusted. I mean, they will talk about the lowest classes of soldiers being dissolute and so on. When they talk about this rugged, robust masculinity, they often have in mind officers, not the foot soldiers. So that classing pretty much fits exactly what you'd imagine. They do have this image of like the farmer who works the land and so on, but it tends to be a kind of ideal against which they don't then tend to suggest that that's what the soldiers and sailors who are serving there necessarily represent. It is interesting though, the class issue, Kevin Sienna has a book that just came out which looks at a lot of the same kinds of themes that I've looked at, but takes class as the central kind of metaphor. And it is certainly interesting there that the lower classes and the brown really do get talked about in the same kinds of effeminizing kinds of ways.
I see.
Yeah, so they're not accorded a masculine.
Right.
Yeah.
Great, that's fascinating. Thank you so much.
So it's interesting. At what point does this, this observational logic, sort of Monty Pythonian, explanations make way to more scientific theory?
They think it's science. So if what you mean is when does it start looking like what we would agree with, something like the end of the 19th century. I mean, the germ theory is the end of the 19th century. The discovery that yellow fever is transmitted by mosquitoes is early 20th century. But I haven't, at least on the mosquito thing, germ theory too, but on the mosquito thing, I have an enormous amount of sympathy for the fact that they don't work it out. The idea that you have this tiny itchy bite on you and that some period later you are coughing up the substance of your lungs so that it looks like, in their description, coffee grounds. The effect just does not go. The cause goes nowhere near the effect, right? So they constantly, it's remarkable. They're always like, they do all of these things where we can go, yeah, well, I know exactly why that's happening. Don't exercise in the early morning. Stay away from swamps. Don't exercise in the late evening, right? Malaria is named because it's about bad air, right? Miasmas, all of this stuff, and they're constantly noting how annoying mosquitoes are. But they're annoying, and they're getting fevers because they live near marshes and they're breathing in miasmatic air. But on that one, it's amazing to me that anyone ever worked it out. Honestly, the mosquito vector thing is wild. And the germ theory, yeah, absolutely. They've got an ongoing argument. Actually, one last thing where I can push back against the idea that we're so clever now. One of their arguments against contagion theories, so whether things are contagious, one, note that yellow fever is not contagious, of course, in any of the ways that we understand contagion. It's not a person-to-person disease. But one of their pushbacks when they say, look, most diseases aren't contagious is, if it's contagious, why doesn't everyone get sick at the same time? Why doesn't this person who's living with this other person get sick? And when I ask most medical practitioners that question, they don't have a fantastic answer for why everyone doesn't get sick at the same time. They just say, oh, you've built up some kind of immunity, or you have in 18th century terms, you have a stronger constitution. They give me all kinds of arguments that are not actually terribly convincing or terribly precise about why that doesn't happen, and it's a big argument for them. Whereas their argument in favour of the miasmatic theory, and I adore this, I try and bring it up all the time, they say, look, if you and I go out walking in the rain and we both get wet, it's not because I got you wet. It's because we're in an environment that's getting us both wet, right? So their explanation of similar kinds of phenomena does work to explain this stuff. But yeah, if you want the answer to the kind of tighter bit, tropical medicine invented at the end of the 19th century, germ theory 1860s through the 1880s, and yellow fever right at the beginning of the 20th century.
I think that's our last question. Oh. Yes, we're out of time. No, we have a couple more minutes. Do we have another question? Yes.
Thank you. I was wondering if you were also thinking about making a comparison to the botany and how plants have been sort of seasoned, or I guess readied for other places, sugarcane, but also, in my case, the corn in Hawaii. So I was just wondering if you see some interesting parallels.
I do, and it's a fantastic question. I'm so glad you asked it. You don't season plants. Think about it. English, you don't season. You season wood once it's chopped down. What you do is acclimate or acclimatize or naturalize plants. So this is one of my, now, actually it's a nice question to end on because this is looking to the 19th century, which is what my next book project is about. The word that will replace the word seasoning is the word acclimatization. It comes around in the 1830s, and it's often in these contexts basically the same thing. right? They go from a seasoning sickness to an acclimatization sickness, a seasoning fever to an acclimatization fever. But here's the thing. Lots of scholars treat them as synonyms, but they're not quite, and it's precisely what's not covered in both of them. You don't acclimatize a wok. You don't acclimatize a cricket bat. You still season them today. What are the things that you season? Animals, vegetables, minerals. What do you acclimatize? Living things. So in the perfect Foucauldian shift from natural history to biology, which happens right around 1800, this is the word shift that goes with it. Acclimatization is the word that you now rope in all living things, and indeed, they now specifically start referencing plants and how you acclimatize them, and also acclimatize people. In the other context, they do too. They're constantly comparing, so Long says, European women in the West Indies are like hothouse flowers, right? They fade very quickly. They bloom and then they fade. So there's all kinds of stuff about how you need a native soil. There's constantly those kinds of comparisons, but it's interesting, they don't use the word season. And so I think part of what's going on in the latter period is that that word allows borrowings from some places, but also cuts off borrowings from other places. Seasoning really did connect metal to people. Acclimatization, metal's no part of that story anymore.
All right. Yes, let's have another round of support.
Thank you very much.